So you're building an application, let's say a complicated application for a bank or for an institution, whereby a simple mistake can easily cause profit loss to the organization. So what do you do to prevent those kind of mistakes, right? So the best way to do this is to write tests, right? So automated tests. So there are different kind of tests that we can write. There are what we call unit tests and also what we call integration tests, right? So for unit test is just for testing a single class or a function, right? So we are just testing a class for its if its functions are working correctly, or we are just testing a specific function if it's working correctly. And then an integration test, that means that you are testing the whole module or services that interact together, right, in an application, or we are simply testing the whole application, right? So in this video, we are simply going to start with unit testing, right? We will start with a simple application. We have this calculator application right here. So we have the calculator class. So in this calculator class, we have the function for addition, right? That will simply add two numbers and then it will then return the results of the two numbers. And then we also have the subtract function, right? That's going to subtract the values between two numbers. And then we have the multiply function that's going to just multiply the values between two numbers. And then we are also going to have what you call the division method that's going to divide between two numbers, right? Okay, so for you to create tests in Flutter, right, what you simply have to do is you already have a test folder right here, right? And then, so the convention is that we want to test our class right here, the calculator class, right? So the best way to do it is to go inside our test folder right here, and then we create a file. And then this file will make sure that it's the same name as our class file, right? So it's going to be calculator, and then we'll simply use an underscore and then test.dat. So this will simply tell Flutter that this is simply a test, right? This is simply a test, right? So what we're simply going to do to run our test, we'll simply, let's just create the main function, right? That's going to be executed, right? So in this main function, what we are simply going to do right here is I'm simply going to start with the addition test. So for us to use the test function, we simply have to use the test right here, which is a package from Flutter. As you can see, it's telling you that we have a description. So this description, it will simply describe the test. So if I right click on this test and then I go to definition right here, you can see that we have this function, which is a test, and then it's an object. We have the description and then the body and then timeout, skip, text, something like that, right? So let's go back right here. And then our description, what I was simply going to do is I'm going to say, just say given two numbers, test if their sum is correct. So this is going to be the description of our test right here, right there, right? And then for the body, what we simply have to do here is we simply use a function, right? So, and then let's just use a semicolon here, right? So for this function, what we simply, so I forgot, this is supposed to be a main function, right? So it's supposed to be a main function. So for this test, what I'm simply going to do right here is we are simply going to test it, right? So what we are simply going to do is the first thing that we need to do is we need to set up, right, our calculator, right? So what I'll simply do is simply set up our calculator. Calculator is equal to the calculator class, right? So simply instantiated our calculator there. And then the next thing is the value. Final value, right, is equals to calculator. So calculator dot, and then what do we want to do? We want to add two numbers right here. We are going to add 5 and 2, right? 5 and 2. And then now the next step is what we call assertion. So assertion is simply trying to see if a given scenario is correct, right? So to do that, what we simply have to do is from the Flutter test package, we have the expect, right? And then you can see that it has an actual and then measure, reason, right? And then the actual value that we want to test is our value that we added, right? And then the measure that is simply 7, right? So we want to test if this value is equal to 7, right? And then what we simply have to do here is let's run our, I'm simply going to open my terminal, right? I'm simply going to open my terminal, right? So I'm simply going to open my terminal right there, and then we'll simply wait for it to finish loading. Okay, so to simply run our test, what we simply do is we'll use the command flutter test, right? And then let's run it. As you can see, it's loading. And then we have the widget test. We already had a widget test right here. So what I'm simply going to do for the widget test is I'm simply going to get rid of it, right? And then we want to be left with our calculator test, right? As you can see, yeah, we can see that all tests passed because the value is 7, which is the actual value right there. If we say let's change it to 6 right there, let's see if it will pass our test. Yeah, you can see that now it didn't pass our test because it's telling us the expected value is 6, but the actual value that we're getting is 7, right? So that means that our test failed. In this case, you can easily catch if there is any error with our function, right? But let's just change it back to 7. All right, so what we are simply going to do here is let's do the same thing for, let's also create a test for subtraction, right? So what I'm simply going to do here for the description is test subtraction between two numbers. So this is the test description, right? Okay, test subtraction between two numbers. So what we want to do is we want to subtract 5 and 2, and then we know that the actual value is going to be 3, right? So let's run our tests. You can see it's telling us that expected value. Okay, it's because we didn't change this to subtract. Let's change this to subtract, right? And then let's run our tests. You can see that all tests passed, right? We can also run using this function right there, right? The run function. You can see there's a run function there, right? So we can also run it using that. As you can see, all the tests passed. Okay, so now let's do the same thing for the multiplication, right? Test multiplication between two numbers. Test multiplication between two numbers. So if we multiply 5 and 2, we are going to get 10, right? So the actual value is 10, and then we can also use multiply, right? And then what we can also do is we can also do it for division, test division between two numbers. Test division between two numbers. So we want to divide 5 by 0. Then yeah, it must give us an exception because we cannot divide it by 0, right? All right, so now let's run our terminal. Let's run our tests. Okay, some tests failed, so you can see cannot divide by 0. right there. You can see you cannot divide by 0. So let's say if we divide by 2, that we are going to expect 2.5. Right, so let's run the tests. You can see all tests passed, right? So these are the tests. So there is another method that we can also use. So if we go inside our main function right there, right, what we can easily do is, let's just create this variable, the calculator variable right here, right? And then we'll also use the setup function, right? So we can also use the setup function. So what this setup function does is that instead of instantiating our class inside our test functions, right, we can just instantiate inside our setup function. Because this setup function, it runs before all tests, right? Registers a function to be run before tests. So before our tests are run, what we want to do is we just want to instantiate our calculator class like this. So now what we can simply do is we can simply get rid of these values right here. And then the other thing that we can do is that you can see that these tests, right, the multiplication, division, subtraction, and addition, they belong to sort of like same group, right? Calculator class, they belong to the same class. So what we can simply do is we can simply group these tests, right? We can simply group these tests. So to group them, we can use the group function right here. So group function, and then the description, what we can simply do for the description is we can simply call it the calculator test. And then the body, what we're simply going to do for the body is we are simply going to return related tests, right? So now that we have done that, so let's then run Flutter test. You can see it's telling us that all tests have been passed, right? And then let's try to run. Okay, so we forgot to add the addition, so let's add it inside. And then what we can simply do is we can simply run all the group tests, right? You can see, as you can see, given two numbers, you can see all the tests right here, and then all the results, and then these are the new results you can see. So these are just grouped tests, right? But then what happens if, for example, we are getting data from an API, right? So let's say we are making HTTP request to an external API. So what we can simply do is we can do what we call mocked tests, right? So for mocked tests, make sure that you're tuned for the next video. Thanks for watching, guys. Cheers.